Few things are more frustrating than losing a game because you've been locked down by traps. So in this video, we're going to get our revenge by counting down some of the best specific anti-trap floodgates in the game. And starting off at number 10, we have Mirage Dragon. This is a level 4 light dragon with 1600 attack and 600 defense. And its effect is that during your battle phase, your opponent cannot activate trap cards. This card, alongside its dark counterpart, Pitch Black Warwolf, were decent tech choices for beatdown decks in several of Yu-Gi-Oh's ancient formats. While their stats are admittedly just barely decent, they were at least enough to beat over Dekoichi, various recruiters, and DD Warrior Ladies. The main reason to run these two was that battle traps were incredibly relevant back then. For a long while, it felt like most decks just started with triple Sakuretsu and a Mirror Force, though they weren't even perfect at their job, since their attack made them vulnerable to both Bottomless and Trap Hole, and your opponent probably had just as many of those. Mirage Dragon was generally considered slightly better, since there were fewer good light monsters than darks, but you still wanted a good amount of both for your chaos monsters. You'd probably be better off running more copies of Breaker though if you really wanted to counter battle traps, but seeing as how the card was constantly shifting between limited and ban, it wasn't always an option. Still, even if they weren't perfect, they had just enough tournament tops to earn a number 10 spot on this list. And coming in at number 9, we have Dark Contract with Errors. This is a continuous trap that has the effect where, once per turn, if you control a DD monster, you can negate all other trap effects on the field for the rest of the turn. The trade-off is that you take 1000 damage during each of your standby phases. Dark Contract with Errors is pretty much the archetypal version of another card we'll see later on this list, except it saw much less play for a few key reasons. While DD had the potential to be a meta threat as far back as 2015, with combos that could end on multiple interactions like Siegfried, Omega, and Crystal Wing, it ended up not performing as well in the TCG as it did in the OCG. That's mainly because Konami decided to delay the release of their structure deck in the West to push out the Felgrand one first. By the time we finally got the DD cards we've been waiting for, we were also getting the Zodiacs, and it was just impossible to compete with those. So in the end, the archetype famous for its incredibly difficult and intricate lines of play never really got its chance to shine, as the tier 0 threat that was Zeus pushed basically everything else out of the meta. Still, in the few tops the deck had, Dark Contract with Errors was often run in the side deck as a searchable answer, and some extra insurance against trap-heavy decks, able to shut off their entire back row during either player's turn, for the measly cost of 1000 life points during each standby phase. The deck does show up in the meta every so often when it receives support like DD Griffin, and even if the contract doesn't feel as if it's needed anymore, it can still be an option. So with DDD Sage King Alfred on the horizon, we may still see more Dark Contract with Errors in the future. And at number 8, we have Dark Simorgh. This is a level 7 Dark Wing Beast with 2700 attack. You can banish 1 Dark and 1 Wind monster from your graveyard to special summon this card from your hand. Or you can banish 1 Dark and 1 Wind monster from your hand to special summon it from the graveyard instead. Its effects are that while it's face up on the field, it also has Wind attribute, and your opponent cannot set cards. While Dark Simorgh doesn't directly say your opponent cannot activate traps, it prevents them from setting cards. Since we wouldn't get traps that can be activated from the hand until much later, this can be seen as a de facto floodgate for the card type, at least until Infinite Impermanence became a thing. Still, where Simorgh stumbled was that despite having 2 different summoning conditions, it used to be pretty difficult to get out. Wind has never really been the most popular attribute, with good wind monsters being quite rare back then outside of a few exceptions. Even if you played a deck with them, you'd also need to be playing darks for this card to be useful. Assuming you were playing both, not many decks could put up both attributes in the graveyard, preferably on turn 1, for Simorgh to really do anything. If your opponent already had set back row, Simorgh can't actually interact with them, and odds are one of them is a trap that you have to deal with anyway. Even with the ability to come back from the graveyard, needing you to banish 2 cards from your hand is a tough cost, and asking them to specifically be Wind and Dark makes it even harder to justify. Nevertheless, despite its massive downsides, Dark Simorgh did manage to see a little bit of play, especially in Fluenderies thanks to its Wing Beast typing, but its tops still pale in comparison to other cards higher on this list. And at number 7, we have Anti-Magic Arrows. This is a quick play spell that can only be activated at the start of the battle phase. For the rest of the turn, after this card resolves, spell and trap cards and their effects cannot be activated. Also, cards or effects can't be activated in response to this card's activation. Anti-Magic Arrows was the first card that made duelists fear hearing end of main phase, long before Evenly came out. If you successfully entered your battle phase, you could use your turn player priority to activate it as the first action. And since it can't be responded to, your opponent is guaranteed to have all of their back row rendered useless for the rest of the turn. This is a really powerful effect, but it has a fair share of downsides. Since it requires you to waste your battle phase, it's a tool mainly for breaking boards, making it pretty much impossible for the opponent to OTK that turn. Also, you yourself can't activate any other spells or traps after it resolves. This limited the card to a small subset of monster-heavy decks that could set up a big board during main phase 2. You saw it as a tech choice sometimes in Yang Xing variants, and then in some decks playing the Danger archetype, such as Lunalight. Perhaps its best user ended up being Tearlaments, as there's no better deck at building a board while dismantling your opponents than that one. Nowadays, the card is still sometimes seen in Mermail, a deck that usually has trouble playing through back row, and if it weren't for Dominus Impulse, would be playing basically 0 spells or traps in its main deck anyways. Next up at number 6, we have Trap Stun. This is a normal trap card whose effect negates all other trap effects on the field for that turn. It might sound weird to put a trap that negates other traps into your deck, but Trap Stun used to be one of the best cards when it came to playing through back row. The idea was that you would chain it to the activation of a really strong trap like Torrential Tribute, so Trap Stun would not only negate it, but also turn off the rest of your opponent's back row for the turn. And if you were worried about a counter trap like Solemn Judgment, you could also just flip Trap Stun preemptively and play uninterrupted for a turn. Where this card excelled was that it was an anti-trap card that could still reasonably run in decks full of traps themselves, since you'd usually use it during your turn and still have your own traps live on your opponents. Trap Stun saw a lot of play throughout the years, excelling in decks that could turn the whole game on its head in a single turn, like Infernity or Burning Abyss, since that one trap-free turn was all they needed to set up their board. Still, as a trap card that you have to wait 2 full turns to use for its full effect, this card has unfortunately been too slow to see play for several years now. And at number 5, we have Naturia Barkion. This is a level 6 Earth Dragon Synchro monster that requires an Earth Tuner and 1 or more non-tuner Earth monsters. Its effect is that when a trap card is activated, you can banish 2 cards from your graveyard to negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. Barkion usually gets overshadowed by its spell negating counterpart, Naturia Beast, since negating spells tends to be more powerful generically, and its cost also requires more setup to be useful. Still, Barkion was good enough to see play in many decks over the years, provided they could actually make it. As long as you had a couple of cards in the graveyard before synchro summoning it, popping down a Barkion while staring down multiple back rows was one of the best feelings in the game, as it could negate and destroy all of your opponent's traps if they ever dared to activate them. Since its effect is not once per chain, your only real counter to it would be having a counter trap like Solemn Warning to deal with its summon. Decks like TG, Six Samurai, and X-Sabers are just some of the examples of archetypes that could easily go into either the Naturia Synchros. And though they also had many powerful in-archetype options, Barkion would often be the best tool for the job against a lot of strategies. And at number 4, we have Jinzo. This is a level 6 Dark Machine monster with 2400 attack and 1500 defense. While this card is face up on the field, trap cards cannot be activated, and all trap effects on the field are negated. For a very long time, Jinzo was not only the best way to deal with traps, it was one of the best tribute summons in the game, period. Sure, its stats are slightly smaller than the contemporary Summon Skull, but it packs a game-ending effect. This was in an era even before most monarchs existed, so the rest of the competition was nothing to write home about. Still, while it did end up getting power crept by its fellow 2400 attack all-stars, it's important to recall that Jinzo was once so strong, it was even limited on the ban list. Even once other monarchs were running around, this card still managed to see play in many decks over the years. Decks like Dad Turbo really enjoyed this card's dark attribute, as well as the fact that it would massively punish opponents who didn't shotgun their threatening roar on the standby phase. Decks like Burning Abyss and, ironically, Monarchs, once that became a proper archetype, all had a really easy time putting it onto the field. So it was a valid option if you were going up against a trap-heavy meta. More recently, this was an even valid tech in Super Heavy Samurai, since despite being a very powerful deck, it wasn't able to run most back row removal, and so was vulnerable to trap-heavy decks. Since it has a good attribute and type, as well as no summoning restrictions, Jinzo is likely to pop up every now and then as a tech option, as long as there are decent enough ways to cheat it out onto the board. And at number 3, we've got Royal Decree. This is a continuous trap card whose effect is to negate all other trap effects on the field. Decree used to be the ultimate answer to any deck playing a lot of purple cards, and the only reason we can't say it's the best anti-trap trap card is because there are still more entries on this list. Decree saw play in dozens of different strategies over the years. While it's not playable in a deck that wants to resolve its own traps like Trap Stun would be, it has the extra benefit of shutting them down forever. Sure, it might end up being vulnerable to spell and trap removal like MST, but having a card that the opponent must answer before they're allowed to interact with you is nothing to scoff at. Decree is pretty emblematic of monster-heavy decks such as Lightsworn and Necros, which could shut off all of your previous back row with a well-timed Decree activation on your end phase. The downside of also negating your own trap cards simply does not matter when the only other ones you're running are more copies of Decree. Still, there's a reason why this card's spell counterpart Imperial Order and monster counterpart Skill Drain are much more hated and treated more harshly on the ban list, while the worst Decree has ever suffered is being put to 2 for a short while. Monsters and spells are what decks are mostly comprised of, and they can usually deal with anything. So even back then, there were more than a few easy outs to Royal Decree. In the modern age, it's a pretty poor Floodgate, since even trap decks can deal with it easily through hand and graveyard effects. But this was once the ultimate no to anyone who wanted to set 5 and pass. And at number 2, we have Denko Sekka. This is a level 4 Light Thunder monster that cannot be special summoned. While you control no set spells and trap cards, neither player can set spells and traps, nor activate spell and trap cards that are set on the field. Denko kind of revolutionized the game when it came to anti-back row cards when it came out. This was in an age where the good back row wipers were all banned, and while Mystical Space Typhoon can deal with one, nothing was better at dealing with multiples than this card. Denko is basically a Jinzo you can normal summon without tribute, except it also deals with any set quick play spells your opponent might have. It is even useful going first, as preventing sets can actually mess up the game plan of decks like True Draco and Metal Foes. Even though Denko can't be special summoned, many decks were willing to give up their normal summon for it if it meant that your opponent's traps were useless against the rest of their hand. This made her especially good against pendulum decks, as by their nature, they could play well without the normal summon, and generally did not rely on traps themselves. Denko's Thunder typing also gave it some innate synergy in Thunder Dragon Dark, and she could even be searched through the effect of Thunder Dragon Fusion, even if it would take an extra turn to do so. She still sees some play every now and then as a pretty unexpected option, but in a world where Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched exists and are at 3, it's harder to justify her inclusion in most deck lists. And finally, at number 1, we have Red Reboot. This is a counter trap that can be activated from your hand by paying half your life points. It negates the activation of any other trap, sets that card face down, and then your opponent can set one other trap directly from their deck. However, for the rest of this turn after the card resolves, your opponent cannot activate trap cards. Reboot is the only banned card on this list, and there's a really good reason why. The card came out in the Link era, a time when most decks weren't playing generic traps anymore. That's probably why Konami thought it would be okay, but it just ended up being one of the most frustrating side deck cards ever. Every other card on this list requires either being set beforehand like Trap Stun, or takes resources like your normal summon like Denko. But Reboot literally only needs to be in your hand to be alive. Requiring half your life points and letting your opponent set a trap are not reasonable costs, when at the time this card came out, you were almost guaranteed to either kill your opponent or blow up their back row the turn it resolved. Reboot was extremely frustrating to deal with, since as a counter trap, the only answer to it was another counter trap of your own, making it feel like a solemn check which you would often just fail. While back row hate can be beaten with graveyard or lingering effects, Reboot just reduces all of the trap deck's interactions to nothing if it goes off. This card only became more toxic as traps became less and less common in the meta, as this card type really needs all the help it can get. This all led to the card getting limited and eventually banned where it is today. Still, that's only true for the TCG, as it's still legal in both the OCG and Master Duel. The biggest argument for this card is that it is basically the only way to deal with lingering floodgates like Dimensional Barrier when you're going second, but it's probably better to just ban those as well, like the TCG is doing, rather than letting you fight fire with fire, especially when trap decks end up as collateral damage. Still, there's just no doubt that if you ever looked for the card that best shuts down traps that was ever printed, it'd obviously be Red Reboot. And the fact that we'll probably never see it come off the list in the West solidifies it at the number 1 spot on this list.